The presentation of Anarchism, a social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Hello, this Anarchist essay is entitled The Anarchist Big Three and the Siege of Sidney Street, and I'm Andrew Whitehead. The besieging of 100 Sidney Street in London's mainly Jewish East End in January 1911 was the final drama in a succession of armed robberies and shootings attributed to Latvian anarchist émigrés. The anarchist trinity of Peter Kropotkin, Errico Malatesta and Rudolf, the Big Three as I call them because they were among the most prominent and influential of European anarchists, were all at this time living in exile in or near London. All set their face against armed crime and revolutionary expropriation. Indeed, in the aftermath of the shootout in Sidney Street, Malatesta wrote an article for Rocker's Yiddish language weekly, Der Arbeiterfreund, or The Worker's Friend, in which the Italian anarchist stated that both the theory and practice of robbery is contrary to the anarchists' political standpoint. But as I'll demonstrate, there were links, some of them startlingly direct, between these anarchist luminaries and the Latvians who gave the movement a bad name. What the Latvians got up to, and the political and public response to it, is explored in my new book, A Devilish Kind of Courage, Anarchists, Aliens and the Siege of Sidney Street. This talk offers a window on one aspect of my research. I should very briefly recap why Latvian anarchists were using semi-automatic pistols in the streets of London. The 1905 revolution in Latvia, then part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, was repressed with great severity, including arbitrary executions, torture and sexual violence. Several thousand young Latvians went into exile. Some of them had been hardened by the brutal treatment they had suffered and by seeing friends and comrades killed, and had resorted to using powerful firearms which could be bought on the black market. On occasions, they staged robberies to raise money to buy arms and to support the families of political prisoners. A small number among these Latvian leftists became attracted to what was, in the Baltic states, a new political movement, anarchism. And a few maintained the same style of politics, including expropriation, when living in exile in France, Germany, the United States, or Britain. Most, but not all, those responsible for a spate of armed crime in Britain were Latvians. Most, but not all, had some association with the anarchist movement, and particularly with a group called Līsma, or Flame, the title of an anarchist journal in Latvian. That story has been retrieved in Philip Ruff's rigorously searched book, The Towering Flame. We only know about those armed robbery attempts involving Latvians in the UK which went wrong. There would surely have been several that were successful, otherwise they wouldn't keep resorting to crime. In Motherwell outside Glasgow in April 1908, 3 men, at least one of them a Latvian leftist, tried to rob a bank. They had a gun and a shot was fired. 9 months later, 2 young Latvians, both armed and both probably anarchists, tried to grab the wages money being delivered to a rubber processing factory in Tottenham in North London. Again, shots were fired, but the robbers got away with the money. The factory was just opposite Tottenham police station, perhaps something the Latvians had overlooked, and police and others gave chase. The pursuit lasted 2 hours. The gunmen made their way across the marshes, at times turning and firing at their pursuers, and variously hijacked a tram, a milk cart, and a vegetable seller's cart. Farcical, but for the 4 lives lost. Both gunmen died. They shot dead a policeman and a bystander, a 10-year-old boy. The attempt to burrow into Harris's jewellery shop in Houndsditch in the City of London in December 1910 was much more sophisticated. The would-be robbers hired a small house backing onto the jewellery shop and were equipped with tools, including cutting gear and a gas cylinder. To cut a long story short, the gang were interrupted by the police and shot their way out. 3 police officers suffered fatal injuries, 2 more were seriously injured. It was, and remains, the worst single incident in the annals of the London police. In the confusion, the robbers shot one of their own. George Gardstein died in rooms in Whitechapel the next morning. The key members of the gang promptly fled, Max Smoller to France. Peter the Painter, who was not at Houndsditch but was certainly implicated in the robbery, probably across the North Sea to the Netherlands. Nina Vasileva tried and failed to get to Paris. 2 men, Fritz Svars and William Sokolov, both present when the policemen were shot, hid closer to hand in the home of Sokolov's lover, Betsy Gershon, a second-floor room at 100 Sidney Street in Stepney. The full story is in my book, but in a nutshell, after a couple of weeks the 2 men turned to a comrade to find a new refuge for them. He was an informer. The police surrounded the building in the early hours of the 3rd of January 1911. At first light, a gunfight started and lasted for 6 hours. Probably 1,000 bullets were fired in total. The police took the remarkable step of summoning troops to their aid. The Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, rushed to the scene, so completely upending the conventional chain of command. The house eventually caught fire. Churchill ordered the fire brigade not to douse the flames, and the bodies of the 2 gunmen were found in the charred debris. One had been shot, the other suffocated from smoke inhalation. The Siege of Sidney Street caused a sensation. The newly established tabloid press was all over the story. There were angry demands for much tighter restrictions on immigration and a loud chorus of poisonous anti-Semitism, even though most of those involved in the robbery attempt and the shooting of the policemen were not Jewish. So how does all this impinge on what you could call the mainstream anarchist movement and the trinity of Kropotkin, Malatesta and Rocker? Well, at that time there were several parallel anarchist movements in London. A small movement centred on the journal Freedom in particular, a larger movement of political émigrés, particularly from Italy, but also France, Russia and elsewhere, and a growing number of anarchist activists among the recent Jewish migrants to London, escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe, who congregated particularly in and around Stepney in the East End of London. The key figure in this Yiddish-speaking movement was Rudolf Rocker, a German Gentile who had taught himself Yiddish and was for many years the editor of London-based Yiddish anarchist papers and journals. In February 1906, Rudolf Rocker hosted the proceedings at what was a big day for the movement, the opening of an anarchist club on Jubilee Street in Stepney, in what had been a Methodist church. The building was large, with a hall able to take an audience of several hundred, a library and smaller meeting venue, a cafe, and next door a building where the weekly paper Rocker edited, Der Arbeiterfreund, was produced. That had a remarkable weekly print run of 4,000. Malatesta sent a letter of congratulations at the opening of the club. Kropotkin, already frail, turned up in person and was cheered enthusiastically as he made his way to the platform. The hearts of our brothers, Kropotkin declared, will be gladdened to know that here in London you have a home where they will be sure of finding a welcome awaiting them if circumstances should force them to leave the land where they are now fighting so nobly in the cause of liberty. Kropotkin's part in the Siege of Sidney Street was entirely tangential. Some of his pamphlets were found by police when they searched the rooms of suspects. The Jubilee Street Club chose not to serve alcohol. That meant that entry did not have to be restricted to members. Anyone could go there. And Kropotkin was right. It became a refuge of a sort for new migrants, particularly political émigrés. A few decades ago, I interviewed Nellie Dick, then in her late 90s, who started an anarchist communist Sunday school in the club. She related to me how when police came across new migrants in the streets of the East End, with no money and no English, they brought them to the Jubilee Street Club, knowing the newcomers would find help there. Nellie, who was born Nemi Ploshansky, also told me how in the club she met a group of young men who wanted her to teach them English, a role that she'd taken on for others. It didn't happen. Nellie was still a teenager, and her mother forbade her from visiting the men in their lodgings. She says that she later discovered they were caught up in the Houndsditch and Sidney Street incidents. Most of the Latvians involved lived in the East End. It's where new migrants from Eastern Europe gravitated to. They often ate, met and socialised at the club. Every one of the gang, said the head of the City of London Police, was a constant and well-known frequenter of the Anarchist club in Jubilee Street. Perhaps an overstatement, but not too far-fetched. The police witness statements demonstrate how central the club was to the Latvians and their associates. Luba Milstein, whose partner Fritz Vars died at Sidney Street, went to the club most Friday and Saturday evenings because she knew there would be cheerful company and the chance to speak in Russian. Yorka Dubov attended lectures in astronomy. Karl Hoffman and Jacob Peters went to concerts there. Nikolai Tokmakov played the mandolin at some of those concerts. Nina Vasilieva encouraged her landladies to come along to the club. Fanny Gordon first met her anarchist boyfriend there. And particularly significant for our purposes, the Jubilee Street Club is where George Gardstein, one of the architects of the Houndsditch robbery, the one who died from a comrade's badly aimed bullet, met Errico Malatesta. They were introduced by a common friend, another anarchist. Gardstein became a regular visitor over several months to Malatesta's small engineering workshop in Islington. It's likely Gardstein was making and adapting equipment to be used in the jewellery robbery. Malatesta also supplied the large gas canister used by the robbers, along with a pressure gauge, a valve and some rubber tubing. When the police visited the shop which sold the canister, they not only confirmed that Malatesta had been the customer, they still had Malatesta's business card. Malatesta was well known to the police, who regarded the Italian almost as the devil incarnate, believed, on no apparent evidence, to be involved in counterfeiting and other criminal activities, as well as political evangelization. In the aftermath of the triple police murder, he was brought in for questioning and required to attend identity parades. He insisted to the police that he never knew Gardstein's name, that he had no idea a robbery was planned, and he was not complicit in any of the crimes the Latvian anarchists carried out. Malatesta was probably telling the truth. He had been naive but not complicit. Remarkably, the police believed him. He was neither arrested nor charged, though he was summoned as a prosecution witness at the Old Bailey trial. Rudolf Rocker said that Malatesta told him the police at Scotland Yard had behaved admirably. Rocker added in his memoirs, "I am sure that in any other country the police would have played up Malatesta's political beliefs in such a way as to implicate him in the affair." The Evening News showed initiative in tracking down and talking to Malatesta about the Houndsditch incident and other such acts of violence by émigrés. "It is a mistake, foolish, useless, criminal," the Italian declared. "Anarchism does not include the robbery of safes and the shooting of policemen who frustrated." But he was not out of the woods. The following year, Malatesta was accused of criminal libel following a bad-tempered spat with another Italian anarchist, Ennio Bellelli, who was very probably an informer. The jury convicted Malatesta. Before sentence was passed, a police officer gave damning character evidence that Malatesta was known to the police as an anarchist of a very dangerous type. He is known as the leader of militant anarchists in this country, in fact in the world. Malatesta was jailed for 3 months and, of much greater moment, was recommended for deportation under the Aliens Act. Only a very active and broad-based campaign saved Malatesta from expulsion from Britain. Rocker and his associates had perhaps taken on too much in signing the lease of the Jubilee Street Club. The weekly running costs were £8. That's about £1,000 in today's money. They could only keep it going by hiring the premises out to all sorts of organisations, political and otherwise. And the landlord was also alarmed about what his tenants were up to. He claimed later that he thought the building was being rented by a Christian welfare organisation. At about the time the Latvians were planning their attempt to break into Harris's jewellers, Rocker and his comrades were relinquishing the lease, although the adjoining building remained the base of their weekly paper. And certainly by the time of the Siege of Sidney Street, the famed or notorious anarchist club close by on Jubilee Street had closed. Rocker was strongly against acts of violence which might disturb the asylum so many foreign anarchists enjoyed in Britain. In the aftermath of the Houndsditch police shootings, he was interviewed by the right-of-centre Morning Post newspaper, who found Rocker to be not a wild revolutionary, but intelligent and mild-mannered. I have no hesitation in saying that the present situation in Russia is directly responsible for these crimes, Rocker told the paper. There is no freedom for the press in Russia, no freedom for the workmen to combine. Some Russians became desperados through circumstances. They have no respect for human life, no respect for their own lives. Most of them are Latvians. In the Baltic provinces, the reaction was more extreme, he said, than in other parts of Russia. Rocker's partner, Millie Whitkop, was rather more unguarded when talking to a journalist from the Daily Chronicle, who found himself, he said, hopelessly out-argued by this brilliant, extraordinary and dangerous woman. Millie Whitkop declared of the police killings, "Why all this agitation over the deaths of two guardians of property, when there was no agitation at all, no public outcry, no fierce clamour for vengeance, because every night men and women of the toiling classes were being killed by the inhuman conditions of their lives." In the trial arising from the Houndsditch shootings, only one person was convicted. That was Nina Vasileva, Gardstein's lover. She was sentenced to 2 years in jail for conspiracy to break and enter. Just 6 weeks later, the appeal court overturned her conviction. Rudolf Rocker and Millie Whitkop recognised Vasileva from her visits to the Jubilee Street Club. They also sympathised with her because Gardstein was a well-known womaniser. Whitkop visited Vasileva in Holloway Jail. When she won her appeal, they took her in. She lived for several weeks in the Rockers' flat on Stepney Green while she tried to rebuild her life. Rocker looked back on the time of Houndsditch and Sidney Street as a nightmare period. The Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement never found another permanent venue after the loss of the Jubilee Street building, but the movement continued to grow, and in 1912 played a crucial part in one of the great East End labour victories, the tailors' strike against the sweating system of subcontracting. Rocker regarded the next 2 years as the peak of the movement in the East End. It was not the Latvians' reckless use of weapons which led to the eclipse of the anarchist movement in the East End, but the impact of the First World War and the counter-attraction of the Russian Revolution. Kropotkin returned to Russia in the aftermath of the revolution. Rocker was interned as an enemy alien during the war, planned at one point to go to Russia, but was sent to the Netherlands as a staging post to repatriation to Germany. Malatesta too chose to end his long years in exile. By the close of 1919, all of the big three I've been talking about had moved from London. The Arbeiterfront was revived after the war, but never regained anything like the sales or influence it had enjoyed before 1914. As for the Latvians and their associates, well, they'd scattered. The police discovered the name of Peter the Painter, Jānis Zaklis, but as they had insufficient evidence to extradite or convict, they put little effort into tracking him down. Several of those in the group or on its fringes embraced Soviet communism. Jacob Peters infamously became a leading figure in the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, before dying in one of Stalin's purges. Nina Vasileva worked in London in the early 1930s for Arcos, the Soviet Trade Office. Luba Milstein emigrated to New York, where she lived with another of the group, Karl Hoffman. Both had a lifelong loyalty to Moscow communism. And while this may not be cause and effect, the same streets in Stepney that provided a base for Britain's best-supported anarchist movement were, a generation later, at the heart of the only English constituency in the 1945 election to vote in a communist MP. This is Andrew Whitehead, signing off.
Thank you for listening. To help others find Anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.